China has a very dynamic, very anarchic almost innovation tech system where lots of small players, lots of unknown players rise quickly because they have great solutions. I think we gave China an incentive to become smarter, and they actually used it very productively. And that's an irony.
Today's guest in the Guten Tag podcast is Ansgar Baums, a leading expert in geopolitical risk management and technology, and co-author of Tech Cold War, a book exploring the global battle for technological dominance. What do you think we often misunderstand about China's technological advancement?
I think we just gave China what it lacked before, which is a necessity to actually work in a constrained environment and get better with fewer resources.
What is the Tech Cold War? What is different than the previous Cold War that we had?
We thought digital technologies are global by nature. It's their nature. They want to be global. They cannot be constrained by states or by nations' borders. They want to be global. This is what technology wants. If we are that powerful and that great, why is life so miserable right now for many people in the US? That's the big contradiction.
What is your biggest prediction for the next years?
One prediction I'd make is that
we want to thank one of our sponsors for supporting this podcast. WonderTax is a platform that makes your tax declaration in Germany easy. Try it out for free and only submit if you're fully satisfied. Visit gutentag.wondertax.de and give it a try. Now, without further ado, let's start with the conversation. Ansgar Baums, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for the invite.
Thanks for being here. I know now that you had a very nice winter break.
Yeah, awesome. I went to Oman, one of my favorite countries, so highly recommend it. One of the best options you have in winter to get away from the snow and the cold.
Ansgar, in the Tech Cold War, you talk about how countries compete over technology. Recently, the Chinese company DeepSeek created a powerful AI that's cheaper, faster, more efficient, better results, which is better than some of the U.S. big AI companies such as like OpenAI. What do you think we often misunderstand about China's technological advancement?
So first, I think lots of open questions still, right? And AI is moving very, very quickly. So any benchmark, any results are very preliminary, and surely they will be overtaken by other solutions. But it's surely the DeepSeek case clearly showed that China is very competitive in that space. And this despite all the efforts that went into trying to limit the access of Chinese companies to high-end semiconductor chips over the last year. So the Biden administration spent a lot of time and money in trying to restrict this access, like the controls on NVIDIA chips, etc., pp. And still China is performing very well. And I think that came as a surprise to many, because I think we tend to underestimate the dynamics in China with regard to tech innovation. So there's this kind of caricature of China that many have in their heads when they talk about China and tech, which is this kind of idea of, in China, President Xi controls everything and nothing happens without the CCP, and it's basically all state-directed, and state-owned enterprises, SOEs are the main players, and it's all very control, command, economics happening in China. I think the reality is more nuanced, and China has a very dynamic, very anarchic almost innovation tech system where lots of small players, lots of unknown players rise quickly because they have great solutions. So it's in the end a very vibrant ecosystem, and I think we tend to underestimate it. And for me, particularly interesting is the effects of controls like on NVIDIA chips on the innovation ecosystem. So my key message is innovation is basically a response to a shortage, to a need, to a necessity. And in the end, we created an artificial necessity for China to become more efficient in AI simply because they lack access to the most powerful chips, right? So what you do, you need to get smart to work with the limits set to you with regard to resources. And that's the main driver behind innovation, actually, right?
The limitations, the boundaries.
Exactly.
How do you
boundaries
work within those
are
boundaries?
important for innovation. If you have limitless resources, that's easy. If you face these limits, you really get smart and work harder. And I think we just gave China what it lacked before, which is a necessity to actually work in a constrained environment and get better with fewer resources. And if you look where AI was going prior to DeepSeek, we had this kind of almost like kids playing with cards on who has, which car has the most horsepowers kind of game.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I invested that billion in AI data centers and I invested even more. Mm-hmm. It was all about throwing more resources at the system without really getting smart about how to do more with less. And in that regard, I think we gave China an incentive to become smarter, and they actually used it very productively. And that's an irony.
My theory was that because in the spectrum of tech investment and tech innovation, United States or the US, all the Western world is always playing the VC game, venture capital game. So you put more money so you can create the next unicorns and you can sell them and then you make your profits. So when these companies were making big investments in AI, they don't use the money for optimizing that. You use it to spend. When I had been working in startups here in Berlin and we had the 2013, 2014, the big golden era of VC money, you would have like crazy Thursday parties, summer parties, free pizza every day, yoga lessons and everything, and never thinking about optimizing. It's about just like showing investors that you're using the money so you can inflate the value more and more. I don't know if that's what happened with US AI companies. Inflate your value, spend as much as you can. The more data warehouse you build, the more valuable you become.
Yeah, I think there's a truth to it. I don't mind pizza parties and yoga sessions, so it sounds awesome. But I think the problem is when you benchmark innovation with inputs, right? So the more money you spend, the better you are.
Yeah,
that's kind of crazy. And I think we had that fallacy in AI for some time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who spent more was the cooler company, without really thinking about how else to benchmark.
Yeah.
And I think everybody, I think, learned a lesson. And I hope that sharpens the minds on focusing on the stuff that's really important, which is finding use cases that really sell and appeal to customers and solve their problems. So I think that has been overdue. But it's kind of interesting how easy we fall for that input benchmark fallacy still.
Mm-hmm.
The VC-driven innovation ecosystem has been very successful, right? So, but it has flaws, and I think this input benchmark is one of them.
Do you think that China made that move strategically after President Trump, together with other big tech companies, prepared this big fund of, I think was like, how much was it? Like $500 billion for
Stargate.
AI? Yeah. Do you think that was intentionally released after that was announced?
I guess so. There was some, timing was very conspicuous, right? So it was right after, a week after, a couple of days after Stargate was announced.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, on the other side, I wouldn't bet that, everything in China happens according to a master plan, right?
Hey, liebe Freunde. Sorry to interrupt this amazing conversation, but I need a little bit of help. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can probably see the subscribe button. If you do, it would mean the world to us if you can subscribe. That's the best way to support the show. Because when you do, I can show it to potential guests and potential brands and stuff like that. And it really helps to grow the show in so many ways. Have cooler conversations, cooler guests, and it just helps in everything so much. So if you don't mind, thank you so much. Now, let's get back to the conversation.
So again, I think the system is very anarchical there, and it doesn't mean that everything that's released and comes out is under full control of the CCP according to what happens in the US. I think China is much more, let's say, dynamic and also like focused on their own needs than just shaping everything they do according to what's happening in DC. It's a little bit of a narcissistic view on China, right? China is not always reacting to what's happening elsewhere. It also has its own causes and its own drivers for innovation. And the guy who was behind DeepSeek, barely anyone knew it, and he wasn't a well-known entity in Beijing either. So I guess there were as many people surprised in China by the rise of DeepSeek as there were elsewhere.
This is something that opens the topic about the tech Cold War, and I would like you to explain with your own words and based on what you have written in the book, what is the tech Cold War? What is different than the previous Cold War that we had?
Okay. Let me maybe start first with a general observation on the relationship between technology and geopolitics.
Mm-hmm.
So after 1990, basically the time frame in which Silicon Valley and the IT stack that we use today, like the internet, was invented, is the post-Cold War era, right? Where everybody, it's basically this end of history hypothesis, which I think still holds some truth. Like we internalized it that much that we basically thought we can clearly separate economics from security. And we can separate economics from governments. So Silicon Valley was never keen to get involved in politics, right? DC was not a place where you'd find the cool guys from Silicon Valley. They were keen to keep a distance, and they were thinking like, in the end, governments are a little bit boring. We probably don't need them anymore. So we are global. We are much smarter than governments. So we do everything with governance instead of government, etc. pp. That was the paradigm of the 1990s. And Charles Krauthammer called it the unipolar moment, where you only basically had one show in town, which was the U.S., which dominated geopolitics and it dominated global tech. And I think there was this major misunderstanding of the relationship then between technology and geopolitics. We thought digital technologies are global by nature. It's their nature. They want to be global. They cannot be constrained by states or by nations' borders. They want to be global. This is what technology wants. And I think we mistook this. We mistook unipolarism for globalism. And as the unipolar moment, is fading, and we're entering a world where geopolitics is back and where you have basically a second major power, China, rising, we see that the geopolitical metastructure, which looks bipolarish, is actually shaping technology on a very fundamental level. So I think we will see the end of the global IT stack as we know it within the next decade, and we see the rise of a second Chinese independent IT stack. That means the IT stack is following where geopolitics is leading, right? And that's a very, let's say, different. If that's true, I think the playing field for tech companies and any company who is employing tech is changing fundamentally. You now have to make a decision. Do you want to be a one-stack company, basically, serving the total addressable market on one side of the geopolitical fault line, or do you want to be a two-stack company who plays on both sides? And this is, in a nutshell, I think that's the major strategic decisions were, discussed right now in many boards in tech companies across the globe.
Can you explain what do you mean by stack?
Basically, if you think about IT, it kind of makes sense to think of it in layers, and it starts basically on the ground with connectivity like cables, and compute power. So compute architectures, semiconductors, and then you layer on top connectivity, operating system, endpoint devices, and then at the top platforms and applications. And these stacks are, they're highly dynamic. They differ widely across where exactly you look at, but in the end it means the stack has, the layers of the stack are connected with each other. And this connectivity between the layers provides you functionality. So, for example, if you trigger a QR code with your iPhone with a camera, that's an endpoint device where you basically take a picture of a QR code, and that picture then triggers a process that uses compute power from semiconductors and connects it with other services. And then that triggers a service that you can use like banking or whatever. You send money somewhere. So you basically employ the whole IT stack, connectivity, compute power, whatever, with this application on the top of it.
Okay, but that's like in the computer science, the principle of the different layers of computing, basically, exactly. Right? And in terms of geopolitics, how do you translate to geopolitics? Because you were saying the Chinese stack or the one stack company. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so if you think about it, the IT stack from a Chinese perspective, I think the last 10 years have shown that the US is very keen to leverage its control over most of the technologies employed in this IT stack. So, for example, it's the controls on semiconductors, but also data localization requirements and the like, to basically slow down the growth of China. So China is vulnerable to this pressure, and China tries to minimize these dependencies. For example, when Huawei was cut off from the Android operating system, it basically meant that like 30% of Huawei's business were at risk, right? It was a huge blow to this company. And from their perspective, it was key to develop alternatives. What did they do? They developed Harmony OS, which is now an independent operating system for mobile phones and other connected devices. And that basically means Harmony OS is a key part of what I would call a Chinese IT stack. And you can go through layer by layer and see how China is developing alternatives to existing Western technologies, which are dependent on Western IP held by Western companies, which can be used as leverage against Chinese companies. So, and this drive is ongoing. It's happening on all levels of the stack independently.
So we have, like, for example, in China, we have that WeChat is the biggest application where you can do everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't depend on any other payment provider from Western countries. They don't depend on messaging services. They depend only on the things that they have built by themselves.
Yeah.
You mentioned also here market denial or market access denial in your book. Is that what it a little bit what plays a role in that, and that pushes that? For example, China has its own stack in this case, or
market access denial is one tool. Basically, prohibiting companies to access a market where you want to grow a local competitor, for example. This is where market access denial is important. Vice versa, the US is using market access denial for companies like Huawei, or recent case question of TikTok, right?
Yeah.
For different reasons. However, there are also other strategic tools that you employ, right? So China, for example, is investing massively right now in becoming less dependent on Western chip technologies. And that's not only about the companies who are actually producing chips like TSMC, but it's fundamentally also about the compute architecture, which right now is dominant. Western companies dominate that space. So you have the x86 architecture, which is your classical PC chip, whatever. And then you have the ARM chips for your mobile devices. And China doesn't want to be dependent on these chip architectures in the future. So what we see right now is a major investments by China in something that's called the RISC-V compute architecture, which is kind of a competitor to ARM chips, also embraced by Western companies. But for China, it's not merely about avoiding licensee fees to ARM, but it's literally about independence and minimizing vulnerabilities. So China is very interested in pushing RISC-V into most devices to be less dependent.
Interesting. There's also this thing that when China entered the World Trade Organization, there was the first time it was giving access to trade with other countries, especially with the U.S., and they started to violate IPs like intellectual property. But you mentioned in the book that China was not the first one to do that. Germany has done it in the past, and the U.S. has done it in the past.
Yeah, sure. So, historically, the biggest enemy of intellectual properties are fast-growing nations, right? So if you want to catch up on tech development, you basically don't care that much about IP, right? And when Germany was developing quickly to an industrial powerhouse and Great Britain was leading, German companies were known for being IP violators. They copied everything they could their hands on. Same with the U.S. The U.S. was a major violator of intellectual property in the beginning of the 19th century, because they had to catch up, right?
Yeah.
And this is what fast developing nations usually do. So that's not I don't want to excuse China for that, but it's just a historical pattern that we need to be aware of. The opening up China and China becoming part of the WTO, of course, is a major driver of the debate in the US today, by saying we thought we can integrate China in the existing post-Cold War global system that we have established, and WTO was a major part of it. So we believe in free trade, and we expect China to become more like us. That was the fundamental hypothesis of Bill Clinton and all the others, saying, if we open up China and they will become integrated in global trade, they will adopt basically liberal democracy as a governance model in the long run. Progress might be slow and there might be setbacks, but the trajectory was clear, right?
Yeah.
That was the fundamental belief. And China became much more prosperous very quickly, but they didn't become like us, right? And that, I think, is the was one of the major contributors of this rethinking of, hey, what are we actually doing here with China? They're becoming powerful way too fast, and they don't change, and they don't accept our global rules, but they want to establish their own hemisphere of influence, and they don't want to become a liberal democracy. So we were basically wrong. That's the main message with which Trump actually did his first campaign, and he was very successful by pointing out that from his perspective, the U.S. was betrayed, and China was using the liberal trade order to cheat and to become more powerful. And this is a fundamental shift in thinking that has led to an erosion in the commitment to the free trade order in the U.S. that we now see on full display. Right? It's now very clear that the U.S. is no longer the champion of free trade globally, and you can tell, right? If there is no one there who's ready and willing to enforce these rules, lots of countries feel free to actually cut some corners and cheat. And this is why the WTO in headquarters in Geneva is now a rather gloomy place, because people feel like, okay, this order has come to an end, and we are entering a world where free trade is a dirty word, where protectionism is now reigning again, all justified by national security concerns. And this is, I think, the tough new world that we're just entering. And Europe in particular is very ill-equipped to actually adapt, because in the end, the EU was a project
of free trade
based on the idea of free trade. It's basically the DNA of the EU, and it's very difficult to modify your DNA.
Yeah,
in that sense, right?
So are we entering to an end of globalization, or what does that mean for the rest of the world?
Yeah, I think, globalization as we knew it, at least since 1990, I think that has certainly come to an end. It doesn't mean that, a full reversal of everything of it, but it will certainly take a very different shape. And what we see, if we look at the empirical data of how companies are doing business, we have to acknowledge that, a large part of globalization was actually intra-company trade. So companies setting up shop in different parts of the world, leveraging differences in labor force costs, etc., pp., and then, sending stuff around the globe as part of their intra-company operations. And then at some point they sell it to customers, right? Mm-hmm. But this was like 40% of all global trade was actually intra-company trade. And as companies now face all these geopolitical risks, like, oh, I cannot, export my stuff to this country because the US has just implemented new controls, or, there's a major disruption and it's too risky to ship stuff around, the Suez, whatever. Companies change their intra-company patterns and start to adapt more to what they perceive as geopolitical risks and try to minimize them. And that basically leads to a pattern where you have companies changing their structure to be more aligned with the geopolitical fault lines. So you organize your trade more in the geopolitical blocks that are emerging. So you try to do more in the US if you want to sell in the US because of the threat of tariffs. Mm-hmm. Tariffs, for example, you put more assets close to the US or in aligned countries. By the way, this is why the whole Canada and Mexico stuff is so toxic to companies. Yeah, because they thought they're secure if they put manufacturing in Mexico, that they could serve the U.S. market, which seems to be dubious. But we see this realignment, right? And if, for example, if you want to, as a Western company, if you want to continue to sell in China, many companies are actually doubling down in China. They're saying like, I want to sell, I cannot afford to lose the Chinese market, and if there are all these restrictions, I need to put more assets into China. So I will develop products in China for China. And these products are becoming more Chinese because you need to adhere to Chinese standards. You need to adhere to Chinese tastes. And you basically start developing specific products in China for China in the future based on this Chinese IT stack. So you will use Chinese apps to sell your stuff. You will use a separated IT infrastructure to set up your company in China because you don't want to export data anymore, which becomes more and more difficult. And you use Chinese semiconductors because there might be an encryption requirement that's basically forces you to use specific Chinese trusted platform modules or the like. So means companies are adapting their operations and how they look like and how they govern themselves according to this geopolitical fault lines. I think that's the new globalization we see. So it doesn't mean that everything happens in one country, but it just means that the value chains are becoming more attuned to these geopolitical fault lines.
I mean, that's why, for example, the German auto industry put factories in China to serve the Chinese market, which is one of the biggest one, right? And that fact that now China has also a very big and emerging auto industry has also outperformed the German cars.
Yeah, so certainly lots of things happening, right? So the relationship between Chinese local partners of German car manufacturers has changed, right? So if you look at the latest announcements, you see that Volkswagen is partnering with Chinese small companies like XPeng. Before, the Chinese partner was there to distribute and to scale the global product that Volkswagen was selling in China. And now we have basically the Chinese partner taking the lead in development, and Volkswagen is there to add scale and production heft to it. So the relationship with regard to who's actually innovating and who is driving technologies has changed radically. That's one trend that's happening. And then you have this additional complexity of cars are now computers on wheels, right? And all the restrictions currently implemented in China on so-called secure and controllable technology, that's a term in Chinese tech regulation, basically means you have to use Chinese encryption. You have to store your data on Chinese servers. You cannot export data anymore to your headquarters, metadata, whatever. So you basically have a situation where you cannot sell your global stock car anymore without any effort to localize in China. And that basically means the cost envelope of selling a car in China has become much bigger. And that means that the money you earn in China, you have to invest more in China to stay competitive. And that means you cannot subsidize your global operations, which are more costly, with the money you have made in China, right? So Volkswagen closing down manufacturing here in Germany, I think it's pretty clear that one of the reasons is that China also needs to invest more. Volkswagen needs to invest more in China to stay competitive there. So they cannot, send back that much cash as in the past. So you can see that even the corporate financing streams are also localizing and basically also becoming bipolar. In a nutshell, you could argue that companies become, as the world becomes more bipolar in geopolitical terms, companies also become bipolar. To stay in China and to maintain your rest of world operations, your company structure, your finance structure, your product development, your IP development, everything also becomes kind of bipolar. And you have this new strange kind of companies emerging which have two separate entities under one roof.
So basically, if you say Volkswagen, basically you have the German one that runs across the world, except China. In China, you have the Chinese Volkswagen, basically.
And it even goes all the way up to marketing, right? So Audi just launched a new brand in China, right? So Audi got rid of the 4 circles logo. And
didn't know that.
New brand and logo in China. And
do you know why? It was maybe like misinterpreted the logo there, or means something else in
yeah, they had a little bit of a problem that Audi was the favorite car of the Communist Party cadres in the past. So it had this kind of, it's no longer cool. It was the car of the old apparatchiks.
Okay.
And they had difficulties in competing in brand recognition with the new cool BYD and others. So they decided to actually abandon a well-known brand to become more fashionable, which is quite radical. Lots of people criticize it. I'm not a marketing expert. I can tell. I can only say, like, even on the marketing level, you see a bipolarization. Right?
But for example, in terms of, for example, like global companies and Germany, I mean, Germany's biggest engine is the car industry. By growing in China, but staying in China, the money stays in China, the technology stays in China, what benefits brings that to the German entity and the German state? Maybe nothing, or is there still an advantage to grow in the Chinese market?
Well, I mean, companies try to protect their market access, right? So they will fight on all levels in order to somewhat make operations profitable and somewhat benefit from what you actually do in China, and maybe transfer knowledge and the like, access to key technologies like batteries, participating in a Chinese innovation ecosystem to benefit from it. This is what companies attempt to do. But of course, it just got much more difficult to be profitable on both sides of the stack. So the benefits for companies in general, I mean, lower margins, definitely, and also lower tax incomes for German government, right? So that's the thing. Like a bipolar world is less efficient than a unipolar world, and companies can tell, and probably government can tell at some point as well. It's interesting that, just again, I always try to come back to technology history because I think there's a lot to learn. And I think IT is not that special that you cannot compare to other waves of general purpose technologies in the past. So we have one example in the book about Ford operations during the Second World War. So Ford company had a German subsidiary based in my hometown, Cologne. And when, declaration of war 41, Ford continued to operate in Germany under a shell organization, which was put in a trusteeship, very complicated legal stuff. But in the end, it became a bipolar company with Ford US producing for the US Army. And you had Ford Germany. Guess what they did? They produced for the German Army. So 40% of all German Wehrmacht trucks employed against the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa were actually Ford trucks, which is absolutely crazy if you think about it.
Yeah.
But this shows how radically pragmatic companies are when it comes to, protecting their market access. After Second World War, both parts merged again and went along, right? And no one was keen talking about it. It all came out in the 2000s when there was you might remember the discussion about forced labor compensation. And so Ford put in a commission and they found out all this stuff and they published a report, which is online. You can read it. So it was this kind of late reckoning with corporate history and how big the difference can be between patriotism on the one side and how corporations feel they have to protect their market access. So it's a quite dark chapter of corporate history, but I think it serves as a reminder that the world looks very differently when you are a corporate manager and you try to protect your market access, right?
Yeah. There corporations, they see no borders, they see no flags, they measure their stuff on market opportunities, basically.
Exactly.
Same thing with Coca-Cola during the Second World War. Same thing. They had to separate it, and there was like a lack of supply on some of the ingredients that they needed, and then the person in charge of Coca-Cola Germany continued operations and came up with Fanta.
Yeah.
Exactly. So something similar there. How did China did it so fast, and how did a nation that was like in, let's say, completely in poverty, like with no innovation back then, how after, I don't know, so in less than a century has become one of the biggest superpowers in the world?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the...
And technologically also.
Yeah, it's one of the big stories of our lifetime, right? We've seen basically the rise of China from poverty to world power. I mean, historically, again, longue durée, I'd argue a weak China was an anomaly, right? China was always not only a country, it was a culture, and one that, states, maintained their nationhood throughout centuries. And China being weakened, being much weaker than the Western countries, was basically, if you look at it long term, it's a short moment in time. And I think we're now getting back basically to the geopolitical normal. It's it sounds strange, but in the end, the assumption that China would always be technologically behind the West is kind of bizarre when you look at it from a historical perspective. China was for centuries far ahead, right? And they'd say like, yeah, that's who we are. That's the normal. And, the dent was basically, that was the exemption, and now we're getting back to where we actually should be. And this is the Chinese perspective, and you cannot really blame them for that perspective.
It's just so we always been, right, basically.
Exactly.
Right?
You're saying like this, the centuries of humiliation are over, and we're claiming our rightful, spot at the table. So, and here we are.
Yeah, I mean, I think also a lot. I mean, I was reading some of the quotes from Churchill during the First World War, and how he was referring towards South Asia and also mainland China with this kind of disdain on when he was referring to them as we are superior, they are inferior. And I don't know if this kind of mentality was prevalent for so many years that people and other nations really underestimated what Chinese culture is and what the Chinese are capable of.
Yeah, I mean, Churchill had some problems with racism, I'd argue, typically for his time. So he was rather he wasn't the exemption; he was the normal. At least he reckoned that it's best to let China sleep, because when China awakens, it's going to be a giant, right? That's at least he had this insight. So I think, in the end, that's the kind of interesting times that we live in, right? That we see this kind of dramatic development. Lots of problems there for us to adapt. Lots of problems to integrate a big new power like China in the world order. We lack an idea of how it's actually going to work out, this bipolarity, without, falling into what Kevin Allison called the Thucydides trap. So this idea that if you have a global hegemon, a status quo power who's dominant, is challenged by a quickly rising nation, the risk of war is very high. So it goes back to, of course, the wars between Athens and Sparta in classical Greece, where, in the first page, it's a great book actually, and he has this very key, immediate observation right at the first page of his book. He's saying it was the rise of Athens and the fear in Sparta it triggered that made war inevitable. That's a quote from this first page, and it basically, that's in a nutshell, it's the rise of one nation, but it's also the fear that it triggers in dominant power that leads to a high risk of war. And I think this is the situation that we're in right now. The question is it inevitable, or is there a way of actually manage the rise of China without, starting World War III? And I think that's the challenge of our time, and how to find a way to make it work.
I mean, it was also similar with Germany in the First World War. It was the Great Britain was the major power. Then you had Germany, a rising industrial power that wanted to militarize, who wanted to come to the table and say, I also want my piece of the cake in this whole imperialistic world. And that created all of the tensions. And then you had the First World War, where everyone wanted to test who had the best warfare technology.
Exactly. There's a lot of, let's say, a new nuance to looking at the outbreak of the First World War, like with new research coming out, book Sleepwalkers, very important there. I think arguably you could argue there was some truth to what, the German policymakers actually thought, what's this all about? There's a British Empire and we're not supposed to grow anymore. Why? What's the normative reason for just, you've been here first. Yes, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't grow anymore. So we want to claim our share.
Yeah.
And it led to a catastrophic outcome.
Yeah.
Right? We basically destroyed Europe, and you could argue that the whole 20th century was basically a nightmare triggered by what happened in 1914. Now, question now is, what can we learn from 1914 episode in order to avoid similar mistakes today? And Kevin Rudd, the former Australian Prime Minister, has written a great book about the rise of China, and he basically says we need to distinguish 3 levels in the relationship between the US and China. One is about red lines. There are parts that are really where we have overlapping interests, they conflict, and we need to manage them very, very carefully. These are the hot topics like Taiwan, status, independence of Taiwan. This is one bucket. The second bucket is basically economic competition. So, right, the full blown out, like, we want to be best in AI and, we claim the market and we grow companies and et cetera, VP. That's basically competition between great powers. That's the second bucket. And the third bucket is global cooperation. Because, the planet is burning, right? We have global issues like climate change. We have global pandemics, and we need to cooperate at some level for the sake of humanity, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a very odd timing for waging a great power competition when actually the planet is burning and we cannot cooperate on anything anymore. That's a real problem. So how do we make sure that we can separate all three levels and be able to compete, be able to manage our red lines to avoid a hot conflict, as well as cooperate on global issues where we have mutual, interests and benefits of actually doing so. And I think we're still like far from actually having an idea on how to do all three things at the same time without, blowing up the planet. And this is, I think, the major challenge we're facing right now. And the problem that I see, and this was when I spent, a couple of months in DC to write the book, I was a little bit disappointed how few thoughts are actually spent on coming up with an idea of how we could actually live together and do all three things, rather than focusing on, very tactical engagements with like how can we optimize export controls and how can we, get Huawei out of our networks, etc. These are very tactical questions, but the bigger question is, what do we actually want from China? Mm-hmm. What do we really want China to do? Other than, not being there is not an option. China is, you need to deal with China and you need to acknowledge that, China will not go away. So what do you actually want to propose to China that is acceptable to them, but also serves our interest? And this is, I think, where we now actually taking, we're not making even progress. We're basically going back to a much darker place where, the Trump vision of international relations basically, one attempt to strong arm nations after another without any clear vision of what's actually what's the end goal? What do you actually want to achieve?
Yeah. It's just about who screams louder at the moment.
Exactly. It's, I see a lot of discussion about what happened in Munich Security Conference last week and about all the other stuff that Trump has done. And there are people who say like, oh, this is actually a wake-up call for the Europeans. They should invest more in defense, or this is an important topic with Greenland, the ice is melting in the Arctic, and we need to discuss, security when these shipping lanes are opening up and the natural resources, etc. And so this is all justified. Or I'd say like, seriously, yes, I see some important topics somewhat woven into that, but what's completely lacking is a forward-looking strategy that makes sense and actually answers this one question: what do you actually want? How do you want to design a world that incorporates China? And that's completely unanswered. So I have not much patience for this kind of attempts to justify or rationalize what's currently happening. From my perspective, it's a wild, chaotic, non-strategic, bullying. Mm-hmm. Primarily interesting. I mean, that's the thing about bullies, right? They tend to, first go after their friends before they actually confront the real challengers. So this whole strong arming of Mexico and Canada and Europe, this is kind of, these are your best allies in the world. Why are you starting to confront them rather than focusing on the real questions here? It's kind of bizarre what we see right now.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. True. It doesn't really make sense. This is attacking first the ones that were supposed to be the friends. I wonder. Which role plays Europe here? I mean, Europe is now recognized for the major innovator of regulations. Mm-hmm. Has now come up with regulations for AI, despite not having any relevant AI company that I know at the moment.
Yeah, a little bit underwhelming. I agree.
Yeah. Is there a place in the table for Europe, or is it for Europe a risk that China becomes an even bigger tech power? What is the best outcome for the people living here?
So first, I think it's important to recognize that in a in the great power game and its impact on the IT stack, Europe will not be a third power between the US and China. We simply lack the resources and the heft to create an independent third stack. I saw a paper launched by a group that's arguing it's time to build a Euro stack. So you can Google it, Euro stack, and you'll find the papers. I find that really underwhelming as an approach on how to compete. I don't think we have any of the assets we would need in the corporate space to build this third stack. And it would be a highly inefficient enterprise that would basically restrict our TAM and would shrink it even further for European companies to grow. Basically means you try to become less dependent on others, but you would also cut access to markets for European companies.
I mean, already GDPR has made it a bit harder for some companies.
Absolutely. So I think that's it's completely unrealistic. It's a political. It kind of sounds cool politically, and you can sell it probably right now. But from a technology perspective, and if you look at where we need European companies, which means conquering global markets, a Euro stack is an absolute disaster. So it's kind of unrealistic. So I think for the better or worse, Europe is part of the Western IT stack, and I think we should focus on the role that Europe is supposed to play in that stack. So that's number one. Number two, if you think about it, how to manage vulnerabilities and how to make sure that we are not bullied and that we are not pressured, and this commitment to the Western IT stack is not used against us. As I said, the second one is you try to build up a system of codependence or interdependence, where it becomes clear to everyone that we are so integrated and so linked to each other that if you hurt us, you will hurt yourself. And I think this idea of we need to build more assets in Europe, stuff that's so cool that no US company can afford not to use it, then you have assets that protect you from being bullied, right? So I always say, what's the best insurance company for Germany? I guess that 40% of all US companies use SAP, right? That's a great asset to have. So the problem is there's not much other than SAP right now, right? So the goal, I think, must be to be more competitive and to develop cooler tech stuff that is basically conquering US markets. That should be ambition, rather than trying to build your own Euro stack that basically will limit the market.
On cloud infrastructure, for example, we are totally depending on the US, like Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud or Microsoft Cloud. Also, all of them we're totally depending on United States technology. And I think China has its own one.
Oh yeah. The cloud space in China is completely different. There's
but there's no really big, or at least that I know, a big player from Europe that is a big cloud player. So, for example, when we had this whole issues with GDPR and when it was introduced, for a company was very critical, like, where do you put your data centers? Oh, Amazon doesn't have one yet in Germany. And it was like a big discussion. Then they put one in Frankfurt. So, okay, at least now you can put it in Frankfurt. But it was a big dependency for Europe to depend that these companies will comply to the regulations.
So, I mean, it's a complex topic. So first of all, I think, you basically employ technology of US companies, not of the US as such. And I'd always say, let's differentiate between what the US government wants and what US companies want, who actually serve global clients. So as I said, companies can be radically pragmatic. And if German customers, are unhappy with the current cloud offering and are vocal about it, companies like Amazon or AWS in that case and Microsoft and Google will change, and they have done. So we have local compute clusters of all the big hyperscalers in Europe. So you can basically make sure that your data doesn't leave Germany or Europe, whatever. We now have even further going projects like the Delos cloud, where you basically have majority ownership of this cloud is with German companies and not with Microsoft anymore. So very far going commitments of these US companies to be able to be compliant to GDPR and to do what their customers want from them. And that's the most important thing, right? If a big client in Germany says hey, Google or Microsoft, I do not feel comfortable with sharing my data globally. I want to have them localized. Well, they will make a move. So this is how companies work. And that's not necessarily what is dreamed up in DC, but this is how companies react to market realities. So that's, I think, a good thing. And what's not to like about it, right? I think these commitments, if these companies invest billions a year of building these data centers, they have skin in the game, right? And we integrate them here in the economy. So that's great. So that's number one. Number two is, if you then, think about how can we compete in Europe, I think it's kind of boring to think of let's copy the cloud and do exactly the same, but with, European companies, and maybe we add a little bit of open source here because it's cool, whatever. That doesn't make you competitive. This is not how IT works. If you want to, gain market share, you need to invest in the next technologies. You need to not replicate, but you need to become better and build on top of what's already there. And this is what I find kind of underwhelming. If I look at this Eurostack proposal, it's this kind of, let's rebuild, the internet again, but with European companies. It's just like, ask any VC, would they invest in a company, in a setup like that? No, because they want to see the next thing that, creates real value and lets you grow quickly. This is how to think about IT. So I think the European approach to all of this is way too static and too bureaucratic almost, like, it's that's not how technology works.
Well, that's the stamp now for Europe, bureaucracy and regulation. What are your thoughts? I mean, I wanna get into that topic. What are your thoughts on the visit from J.D. Vance in München?
Yeah, it's so I think it was important. So I heard verses like, it's just a provocation and shouldn't, carrot. I think this is not true. It's actually quite significant. I think this speech will live in infamy because it has been really radical. If you think it through and read through it, a couple of things are really important. One, I think we see something that I would call as a populist international movement that he's addressing there. So in the end, he's appealing to his fellow right-wing populists in Germany and in Europe and elsewhere. And he's basically telling the German chancellor and the German minister of defense, like, you don't have democracy anymore because you have the Brandmauer against the AfD, and this is not how it's supposed to be, and you're no longer democratic or whatever. That's basically an interference in domestic policies of a partner country, which would have been, absolutely unthinkable just 10 years ago. It's a major breach of international diplomacy.
Sovereignty.
Of sovereignty. It's an attack on sovereignty, and it's a disregard of how we actually work together as partners, right? And he spoke as a representative of government. He wasn't any random dude. I mean, I comment a lot on U.S. politics. I'm a private citizen, right?
Yeah.
And that's fine. But he's a government representative, and this has been quite a breach of more than just diplomatic niceties. This has been quite a thing, and it you can ask yourself, like, what's the ultimate consequence of this interference in domestic policies? How are you supposed to react as a German government to that? It's quite a sting, and I think it's significant because it erodes a lot of the trust and the foundations that the transatlantic relations have actually been built on. That's number one. That's called into question. Number two, if you think about the proposals now put forward with regard to Ukraine and Russia, basically an opening move by the Trump administration. Hey, let's sit down bilaterally and we will figure out with the Ukraine, we don't even give a damn what the Ukrainians and the Europeans think about it. That's a second major concern, because in the end, and there's even the let's say the perspective of involving China in a settlement to secure a frozen conflict settlement, whatever it looks like, basically inviting China into playing a major role in Europe. I mean, it's kind of crazy stuff, right?
Yeah.
But it seems to be a real I saw some comments on this, that this might actually be a good idea, whatever. It's hard to actually compute what's happening there. Overall, I think, again, the main problem is there's a kernel of truth in all this stuff. That's the problem, right? Of course, Europe has not spent enough on defense. Of course, there is a need to come to let's say, to break the stalemate and to come to the table with regard to Ukraine. The war should end, right? And that's all true, but the solutions offered here are so toxic and are so corrosive with regard to transatlantic relations and the order that we have all benefited from after 1990. And there is no alternative vision, as I said before. I mean, what are you actually proposing as an alternative? Is it really spheres of interest where you like divide like the world and say like, hey, Russia, you can have Eastern Europe, do whatever you want, and we as US care about Panama and Greenland, and China? I don't know. Is this really the world that we want to enter? I think that's a debate that we need to have, and ideally we would have that first as close allies before we actually, the US goes over the heads of Europe and affected countries and is trying to, do a deal that's then dropped on everyone else.
Once, I don't know where I read that it was bad to be an enemy of the United States, but it's worse to be their friend.
I don't know. It's, I'd say, the relationship has always been, we have different interests, and that's fine, right? We had converging interests over the last decades, which was great. Now interest seems to diverge. But I'm actually not quite sure why the US is or the Trump administration,
so bullying,
is so much focusing on bullying in Europe. I mean, literally, if you look at the problems that the US has, and it has many, Europe is not really one of them. I mean, this is kind of show me why Europe is a problem to the US. We are a force multiplier. If you want to replicate the assets, the military assets that you employ pretty cheaply in Europe, I mean, from the hospitals to basically you have access to a whole world region based in your, on your allied structure in Europe. You need to build a lot of plane carriers or whatever to replicate that kind of stuff, right? So it doesn't make sense to alienate Europe. And that's what I really think. There is no logic behind it, and there is no vision behind it. It's just the bullying of someone who's, first picking the weakest in the kindergarten to actually bully. And that's not a very smart strategy. And I'm not apologizing like Europe being lazy and spending, not spending enough on defense, but I just don't see the rationale behind it. And that's what's worrying me. The sentiment in the US is generally, in a nutshell, it's basically, so if we are that powerful and that great, why is life so miserable right now for many people in the US? That's the big contradiction. Like if you look at global GDP or if you look at share of, global population, the US has done tremendously well over the last decades. I mean, the big losers is Europe, not the US, right? The GDP share of the US is stable despite the growth of India and China. I mean, imagine that. That's absolutely fantastic. And still people in the US are really, really not happy with where the economy and the society is going. So there's a lot of discontent here, but it's just hard to see why, their closest allies are actually the culprits. That's what I don't get, and I don't actually see. So I sense that, all this discontent is somewhat projected abroad, but I say, the US is still the strongest power, and if I would have to bet money on China or the US, I would always bet on the US. But the dysfunction of the political system has come to a point where people are actually ready to destroy government. This is what Musk is currently doing.
Yeah.
To basically destroy without having a clear vision of how to replace, to destroy your allied structure, to destroy your own government structures, to destroy the status quo without any idea of what's actually better. Other than, a couple of, let's say, libertarian radicals who think that, a world without government ruled by some tech, whatever, bros, is actually a vision that's something we should follow up on. But it's quite, we're in a stage where destruction is seen as preferable to the status quo, even if you cannot really tell where this destruction is actually leading to. And that's worrying. I mean, it's a quite radical position to take, but I think we have to acknowledge that people feel that miserable that they're actually at this point to say yes to this proposition.
I have a thought on the relations with United States, Europe, and now sitting together with Russia, but not putting Europe in the conversation, in the table. And do you think it maybe because the major support from United States to Europe was after the Second World War to contain communism to expanding further and further in Europe. So there was this big support from United States to Germany, to West Germany, and to the countries in Europe to contain communism. Now, communism is just some ideas that some people have, but it's not a real threat for the United States. Now that they don't need this buffer of contention to communism. They only need to have an understanding with Putin, and then they don't need Europe as this buffer zone.
Well, I'd say, in the end, how important was communism then really as a geopolitical force? I'm a materialist. Funnily, so I'd say communism was a layover over something very stable, which is, Russian nationalist expansion. And it had the paintings of communism for 40 years, and it had different paintings before. And it has another flavor painting today. But the question is still the same: how to manage Russian expansion into its periphery, mainly directed against Eastern Europe. So from Russia's perspective, to the west, to the south, into the Caucasus, potentially into the Persian world, whatever, and towards China. Right? These are the directions that Russian expansionism has taken since Peter the Great. This is what needs to be managed. Communism was just an episode, but the fundamentals are still there. So, and that hasn't changed. So the question is, does it warrant a completely different strategic approach now that we are 35 years after the fall of the wall? And in that regard, this is why I think the Vance speech was relevant and what's currently happening in Saudi with these meetings. And we do not know yet what's actually discussed. But one option on the table apparently is like an agreement with Russia by saying, we accept your sphere of influence and you can, have parts of Ukraine and whatever. This is our agreement. So you can do whatever you want there. And that's that. And so, by the way, in Europe, we're not longer that committed to maintain our footprint there and to contain you there. So we leave it kind of open and see what happens, right? This is creating for Europe. I mean, it's an awful spot to be in. So in that sense, I'd say let's look beyond the kind of ideology framing of the Cold War. It's communism versus the free world. In the end, the fundamental geopolitical realities are much deeper than this ideological layover that we have focused so much attention on and spent so much energy on trying to, describe them as the communist evil, whatever. In the end, the realities are more, let's say, I'm a realist by nature, as you can tell. So I don't give that much on political rhetoric. I think the fundamentals are more stable and on a different layer.
What is your biggest prediction for the next years in terms of geopolitics, technology?
So one prediction I'd make is that efforts to stop the growth of China by putting controls on technology like semiconductors and everything else will fail. We will not make a big dent in where China is going. Rather the opposite. I think tools like export controls on high-end semiconductors actually are adding to the competitiveness of China because we incentivize innovation. That's number one. So I think it's a stupid idea. However, second prediction is the lessons has been learned in Beijing. So Beijing will minimize their dependencies on Western tech. So therefore, I think we will see the emergence of a Chinese IT stack. And consequently, we see companies aligning to these new realities, and some of these companies will become bipolarish in order to serve the Chinese market and the rest of the world market. So That's I think a fundamental reality. With regards to where we're generally going, I think Europe will struggle to formulate a response. So the obvious response right now would be let's unite even closer in Europe. Let's become a stronger player by sharing resources, by giving authority to the EU to actually become, have a more comprehensive policy portfolio to negotiate and let the EU be at the table rather than all the nation states that could be picked apart, etc. Given the state where we're currently in Europe, with the rise of right-wing populism everywhere, no one will touch the EU treaties. No one will renegotiate it. So it'll be very, very difficult for us to up-level basically European unification as a response to these geopolitical threats. But I think this is what we should actually work on. This is the only response that makes sense. So that's a big question mark I have here. With regard to the US, it's hard to see how to rebuild trust in the system and how to fix all the internal problems that the US has. I think, and this sounds funny from a guy who's working for global tech companies for decades, right? But I think the influence of corporations and money on the US political system has been absolutely toxic.
Yeah.
So it's basically captured by vested interests. And I think you can find the root for many of the problems of the US in that dynamics. If you look at the health sector, I mean, it's crazy. The costs for health are, and why is that? Because I think pharma and other companies had way too much influence on regulation. Same goes for banking. I mean, let's not forget the banking crisis, 2008, is one of the major drivers, I think, of discontent in this world.
Yeah.
And it has been triggered by what? By failed regulation. So way too much influence of these kinds of guys on regulation. So, and I think, you can go through the stack and basically see that lots of problems in the US are coming from this source. It's just very hard to see how it's going to be fixed. I have no idea. I'm actually rather pessimistic in that regard. Historically, it's probably like, okay, if you look at major turning points of when the US has changed its way of organizing itself, it was basically major shocks, right? That triggered change. And these major shocks come with a lot of pain. So I'm not sure if that's something you actually look forward to. But the current trajectory in the US is pretty worrisome.
Yeah. Yeah. Ansgar Baums, thank you for coming to the podcast. Where can people find the book?
They can, best to check actually is www.techcoldwar.io. This is where you find all the information and link to the book. Take the ebook; it's easier because we have a US publisher who's mainly focusing on shipping in the US, so much easier to get the ebook.
Great. Okay, so for all the people who want the book, check the link in the description. Ansgar Baums, thank you for coming to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's great talking. Thank you.
Great.